What haunted soldiers in World War II more than bullets or bombs? The answer was a piece of cheese. Hard as stone, greasy, tasteless. A cruel joke in yellow dot. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? But for millions of men and women who lived through the most brutal conflict in human history, food, or the lack of it, became an enemy just as vicious as any army. World War II was not just a war of courage or strategy. It was a war of logistics and, above all, a war of hunger. Behind every battlefront, behind every victory or defeat, there was a silent fight being waged at the dinner table, in cramped kitchens, in muddy foxholes, and in prisoner camps. This is the story of that hidden front, the war for food. And we'll walk through it in 3 terrifying circles of culinary hell: home kitchens, army rations, and prison camps. But before we dive into the trenches, let's begin with something a little closer to home: America's own wartime kitchen. During the early 1940s, even far from the front lines, Americans were forced to adapt to scarcity. Sugar, butter, and fresh fruit were rationed. Housewives became soldiers of creativity. Some turned desperation into invention. One of the most infamous examples: mock apple pie. It looked like a pie, smelled like a pie, even fooled the eye. But the apples? They weren't apples at all. They were Ritz crackers, boiled with sugar, lemon juice, and cinnamon to mimic the flavor of fruit that had long vanished from grocery shelves. It was the taste of make-believe sweet. But tragic. Across the Atlantic, things were even bleaker. Imagine standing in line for an hour, not for a new car or a concert ticket, but for half a pound of butter. In wartime Britain, ration books became more valuable than money. Every family learned to stretch every ounce, every crumb. And when meat disappeared, the Ministry of Food invented something they called Woolton pie. Named after Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food himself. It sounded heroic. It wasn't. The so-called pie was a mush of boiled carrots, turnips, potatoes, and oats under a crust that tasted more like damp cardboard than pastry. It was a dish that could make even the hungriest soldier sigh. Yet it fed millions. Then came the Snoke disaster, a culinary nightmare disguised as patriotism. Britain had imported tons of a South African fish called snoke, hoping to solve the protein shortage. The problem? It smelled like oil and tasted like despair. Housewives were told to make do and mend, but no amount of seasoning could rescue the stench. People joked that eating snoke was the real test of British endurance. Across enemy lines, German civilians were facing their own famine. The Nazi war machine consumed everything: fuel, metal, and food. As supplies collapsed, Germans turned to ersatz, a word that meant substitute, but came to symbolize humiliation. There was ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns or chicory roots. It was bitter, smoky, and utterly devoid of caffeine. Ersatz butter made from crushed turnip oil and chalk powder. And worst of all, ersatz bread, bulked up with sawdust and wood fiber to make it last longer. It filled your stomach but robbed you of dignity. Soldiers joked grimly that their daily bread had more in common with the forest than with food. Everywhere you looked, meals became a battlefield between starvation and pride. In London, mothers hid their tears as they served Woolton pie for the 4th time that week. In Berlin, families drank fake coffee and pretended it was enough. And across the Atlantic, Americans savored their mock apple pies, half thankful, half guilty, knowing real apples were now a wartime luxury. Dinner table had become a front line, and that was only the first circle of this culinary inferno. Next came the soldiers, the men who carried tins of salvation and curses in their packs. Meals that promised energy but delivered misery. Cans that rattled like grenades and tasted worse. In the next part of our story, we'll open one of those tins and find inside not comfort, but a symbol of betrayal: the K-Ration, the cursed meal of the modern soldier. When you imagine a soldier's life in World War II, you might think of gunfire, mud, and fear. But for most men, the true horror came from something smaller. Something packed neatly inside a dull olive green box. Their K-Ration. It was supposed to be a miracle. A complete meal in your pocket, designed by nutritionists, blessed by generals, and mass-produced by factories. Each ration contained biscuits, powdered drinks, cigarettes, a can of meat or something pretending to be meat, and one unforgettable square of processed cheese. At first, it seemed like progress. Soldiers could march farther, fight longer, and never go hungry. But the truth was crueler. That little box became the most hated meal in the U.S. Army. Let's start with that infamous block of cheese. It was called cheese spread, a harmless name for a substance that could survive the apocalypse. Soldiers joked it was harder than a Nazi helmet, and just as dangerous to the digestive system. It didn't melt. It didn't crumble. It just sat there cold and rubbery, daring you to try. Many didn't. Those who did, well, they learned quickly that the battlefield had many forms of suffering. Some ended in explosions, others in constipation. Then came the D-bar, the so-called emergency chocolate. If you imagined a sweet treat for a moment of comfort, think again. The D-bar was engineered to be barely edible, intentionally so. It was packed with vitamins and caffeine, but with a flavor that could make your tongue surrender. The government feared soldiers might eat it too soon, so they made sure no one would unless absolutely desperate. One veteran later said, "It was like chewing on a bar of soap that had survived a house fire." So much for morale. Eventually, the Army replaced the K-Ration with something better, the K-Ration. The bigger cans, more calories, more variety. It was the meal that promised to solve the Army's hunger once and for all. But after the first few weeks, soldiers began to realize the awful truth. Variety was an illusion. There were supposed to be 12 menu options, but most men only ever got 2 meat and beans, or meat and beans with slightly different sauce. Day after day, meal after meal, that thick, greasy stew haunted them. When heated, it released a smell somewhere between a dog kennel and a factory. Many soldiers refused to warm it up, eating it cold straight from the tin, just to avoid the odor. In foxholes across Europe and the Pacific, men traded, buried, or outright threw away their rations. They dreamed of real food, a slice of bread, a fried egg, anything that reminded them of home. And then there was the powdered egg. If hell had a breakfast, this was it. Powdered egg was the Army's great hope, lightweight, nutritious, easy to ship. But in practice, it became a symbol of despair. Open the tin, and you'd be hit with the stench of sulfur, sharp and chemical, like a matchbox on fire. Mix it with water, and you got a yellow sludge that looked like scrambled eggs in theory, but tasted like wet chalk in reality. Even when fried, it oozed a strange sheen, half oil, half regret. Soldiers said it smelled like the devil's socks, and yet they ate it. Because they had to. Because the body doesn't care about taste when the stomach is empty. In every Army mess tent, in every trench and jeep, the same scene played out. Men sitting shoulder to shoulder, chewing in silence. No one complained aloud. They were too tired, too far from home, too aware that food, no matter how disgusting, was life. But the bitterness lingered. Years after the war, veterans could still recall that smell, the sour tanned meat, the metallic taste of ration biscuits, the gluey feel of powdered eggs sliding down their throats. For some, it became a dark kind of nostalgia. For others, it was trauma wrapped in tin. If the home front endured boredom and scarcity, and the soldiers endured disgust and repetition, there was still a darker place to descend, a world where food was no longer a matter of taste or endurance, but pure survival. The third circle of wartime hunger, a place where men and women were reduced to their most desperate instincts, the world of the prisoners. By the final years of World War II, hunger had stopped being an inconvenience. It had become a law of nature. Armies starved. Civilians wasted away. But the most horrifying hunger of all was found in two places on the islands of the Pacific and behind the barbed wire of prison camps. This was the end of the road for food. A place where the concept of meal broke down completely, replaced by instinct, madness, and desperation for Japanese soldiers stranded across the Pacific. Supply lines had collapsed long before their morale did. By 1944, rations meant for a week had to last a month. Rice, once the heart of every Japanese meal, became a ghost, replaced by millet, weeds, and whatever could crawl or swim. On the jungled islands of New Guinea and the Philippines, entire units lived off roots and bark. Men fought malaria and starvation more fiercely than the enemy. Some trapped snakes and rats. Others roasted palm leaves or boiled their leather belts just to trick their bodies into feeling full. There were darker moments still, whispered stories the army never wanted told. When even insects disappeared, some soldiers turned to the unthinkable, the flesh of horses, dogs, and in rare, desperate cases, their fallen comrades died. It wasn't cruelty. It was the collapse of civilization. War had stripped them of everything but the will to survive one more day. A diary found in the jungle after the war contained one line that summed it all up. Rice is gone. Friends are gone. Only hunger remains. If the front lines were hell, then prisoner of war camps were hell with no hope of escape. Food wasn't scarce. It was weaponized in Japanese camps across Southeast Asia, and in German stalags scattered through Europe. Starvation was as constant as the guards. Daily rations averaged 300 to 500 calories, a few spoonfuls of watery rice, or a lump of black bread made from ground barley and sawdust. That wasn't enough to live on. It was just enough to die slowly. One American prisoner in Burma wrote, "Every morning we wake up lighter. You can feel your bones sharpening under your skin." To fight death, men began doing the unthinkable. They ate anything that moved: rats, cockroaches, worms. They trapped lizards with bare hands, roasted them on makeshift fires, and pretended it was chicken dot in some camps. Prisoners would risk being beaten just to pick up potato peels from the garbage piles. They called it gold. And still, even amid that degradation, humor somehow survived. In one German POW camp, prisoners were served a thin beetroot soup. It was so watery, so tasteless, that when maggots began appearing in it, the men actually laughed. They started calling them the meat. "Don't stir too hard," one prisoner joked. "You'll lose the protein." It was a cruel kind of laughter, the last defense of the human spirit when everything else had been stripped away. Starvation didn't just destroy the body, it warped the mind. Prisoners began dreaming about food more vividly than they ever had in freedom. They described every meal they'd ever eaten in excruciating detail: the smell of bacon, the crunch of toast, the sound of coffee being poured. These food fantasies became their survival mechanism. One survivor later said, "I think we lived off imagination more than the soup." But imagination couldn't stop the toll. Men dropped from 180 pounds to 90. Hair fell out, teeth loosened, skin clung to bone. And yet, incredibly, some endured. They survived not because they were stronger, but because they refused to forget that this horror wasn't forever. Every spoonful of that filthy soup was an act of defiance, a way of saying "I'm still here." In a German camp near Lübeck, a British prisoner wrote in his secret diary, "Today's soup was clear as glass. The only flavor came from the rust on the tin bowl." He paused, then added, "But it is still soup. And that means there's still a war to win." That sentence, fragile as it was, captured something profound. Even when food had lost all taste, all comfort, all dignity, it still meant survival. It meant hope. Because as long as there was food, no matter how disgusting or pitiful, the war wasn't over. And neither were they. They called it the food of desperation. But in a way, it was also the food of victory, not because it nourished bodies, but because it proved that even in the deepest pit of hell, humanity could endure. The same soldiers who ate wood bread, drank acorn coffee, or shared beet soup with maggots, they carried that endurance home. And it became part of the reason the world rebuilt. In our next and final part, we'll return home to the quiet kitchens and the full tables that replaced the hunger. And we'll ask one simple question: what did all that suffering teach us about what it truly means to eat, to share, and to survive? When the guns finally went silent in 1945, the world didn't cheer right away. It listened to the hollow echo in its stomach. After 6 years of blood, ash, and hunger, people everywhere sat down at tables that had forgotten what fullness felt like. Victory had come, but it tasted of powdered eggs, moldy bread, and memories too bitter to swallow. In London, the church bells rang for peace, but rationing still ruled every kitchen. Butter, sugar, bacon, the comforts of the old world were luxuries now measured by ounces and coupons. It would take nearly a decade before British families could cook without counting every spoonful. And yet, in that bleak recovery, something remarkable happened. Ordinary people rediscovered the meaning of food, not as pleasure, but as proof of survival. Mothers saved their last bit of flour to bake a loaf for the neighbors who'd lost everything. Children learned to savor an orange like treasure. And soldiers, home from the front, found that even the simplest meal, a warm soup, a slice of bread, a cup of real coffee, could bring them to tears. Because after you've eaten misery, even a crust of bread feels holy. War had stripped food down to its essence: survival, endurance, unity. It reminded the world that civilization itself depends on the ability to feed one another. That a loaf of bread can mean hope, and a can of soup can mean life. In America, abundance soon returned. The factories that had produced rations turned to breakfast cereals and canned fruit. But some veterans could never eat the same again. One Marine refused to touch chocolate for the rest of his life. The memory of the bitter bar too strong. Another soldier joked that he'd rather starve than eat beans again. But behind that laugh was a lifetime of remembering what starvation really meant. Food had become a language of memory, every meal. A quiet monument to endurance. When aid ships finally reached the ruined ports of Europe and Asia, people wept at the sight of sacks of flour and tins of milk. They were the new symbols of peace, gifts of life, not instruments of war. In Japan, starving civilians lined up for hours to receive bowls of rice distributed by occupation forces. Some bowed before eating, not out of fear, but out of reverence, because after years of hunger, even rice had become sacred. In Germany, children born during the blockade grew up on stories of ersatz bread and beet soup. They learned gratitude not from fairy tales, but from famine. And in America, families sat around their tables once again, eating real apple pie instead of the wartime mock apple pie made from crackers and sugar. But even as they laughed and shared stories, the memory lingered that for 6 long years, the world had learned what it meant to live without comfort and to love food not for its flavor, but for its power to keep hope alive. When historians talk about World War II, they speak of battles, tanks, and generals. But the quiet victory, the one written not in blood, but in crumbs, happened at every stove, every mess tent, every prison bowl. It was fought by mothers who boiled turnips instead of crying, by soldiers who chewed through rubbery cheese because there was no other choice, and by prisoners who shared a spoonful of soup just to remind each other they were still human. That's what won the war. Not just courage or firepower, but endurance. The will to survive even when the world had nothing left to give. So the next time you sit down to eat, whether it's a fast food burger or a home-cooked meal, take a second to remember them. The millions who endured tasteless rations, fake coffee, and despair in a tin can, so that we could live in a world where food is more than survival. Because victory didn't just come from the battlefield. It came from the kitchen, from the pot that never stopped boiling, the bread that kept being shared, the stubborn belief that life was still worth feeding. World War II was fought with bullets, but it was won with hunger. And every meal we eat today, in comfort, in peace, is the final course of that long, bitter war.